Nobody in that hospital knew. Not Dr. Kim, who barked orders at her every morning without looking up from his clipboard. Not Nurse Park, who made her remop floors that were already clean just to feel important. Not the hospital director, who once told her to use the staff entrance because the front lobby is for patients and professionals. Nobody knew, and Tyla, she never told them. If you love K-drama chaos, Mafia tension, and the kind of love that refuses to stay buried, stay right here. Because this story is about to get messy in the best way. And if you're new, subscribe now, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when they find out the truth about Tyla. She showed up every morning at 6 a.m. in her green uniform, her hair tucked under her cap, her earbuds in, her face unbothered. She mopped floors, she emptied bins, she wiped down surfaces that people touched without thinking. She smiled when she needed to. She stayed quiet when it was smarter. And at the end of every shift, she took the bus home, heated up her jollof rice, called her mother in Lagos, and went to bed. That was her life, simple, clean, invisible, until the day a black helicopter with no hospital markings landed on the roof of Seoul Grace Medical Center on a Tuesday afternoon. No warning, no clearance, no explanation. And the man who stepped out of it, tall, dark suit, face like God, took his time. Walked past 3 security guards, 2 hospital directors, and 1 very confused receptionist, and stopped in the middle of the hallway. Right in front of Tyla, who was holding a mop. He looked at her, she looked at him. The entire corridor went silent, and then he said, in a voice that had clearly never been told no in its entire life, "Yobo, you didn't answer my calls." Tyla blinked. "I was working, I sent a helicopter. I can see that. You still didn't answer." She looked at the mop in her hand, then back at him, then at the crowd of hospital staff that had gathered and were currently experiencing what could only be described as a collective mental breakdown. She sighed, "I just mopped this floor." That was the day Seoul Grace Medical Center learned that their hospital cleaner was the fiancé of Shin Ye-won, chairman of the Shin Group, heir to one of the most feared criminal empires in South Korea, a man whose name made politicians nervous, and whose face had never once appeared in a police file, despite the fact that everyone knew, exactly what kind of business his family was really in. And she had been mopping their floors for 8 months. Let's go back to the beginning. Tyla Ademi arrived in Seoul on a rainy Wednesday in October with 2 suitcases, 1 scholarship letter, and a very optimistic attitude that Korea was going to be different. She was 24. She was from Lagos. She had a degree in biochemistry, a postgraduate acceptance from Fiancée University, and approximately enough money in her account to survive 4 months if she was careful and did not, under any circumstances, develop a bubble tea habit. She developed a bubble tea habit within the first 2 weeks. By month 3, she had a part-time cleaning job at Seoul Grace Medical Center to cover the gap. It was supposed to be temporary. She would finish her research program, submit her thesis, get her certification, and move on with her life. 8 months later, she was still there, not because she failed. Because Korea, as it turned out, was expensive in ways that her scholarship letter had not mentioned. And because her thesis supervisor, Professor Choi, had the organizational skills of a broken compass and kept pushing her deadline. And because somewhere in between the mopping and the studying and the jollof rice and the calls home to her mother, Seoul had quietly, without her permission, started to feel like somewhere she belonged. She had friends now, real ones. Bomi, a nurse on the 3rd floor who snuck her extra hospital canteen food and talked too fast when she was excited, which was always. And Kweku, a Ghanaian pharmacist who had been in Seoul for 6 years and had mastered the art of surviving in a foreign country with humor and very good jollof. Though he and Tyla had an ongoing and deeply serious argument about whose jollof was superior that would never, in this lifetime or the next, be resolved. She had her routine, she had her peace. And then she met Shin Ye-won. It happened on a night shift in November. The hospital was quiet. It was past midnight. Tyla was doing her round on the VIP floor, the 4th floor, where the private rooms were, where the patients had money and the corridor smelled like expensive air, when she turned a corner and nearly collided with a man sitting on the floor outside one of the rooms. Not lying down, not unconscious, just sitting on the floor in a suit that cost more than her rent, back against the wall, eyes closed, tie loosened. Tyla stopped. She looked at him. She looked around to confirm she was not hallucinating. She looked at him again. "Sir," she said, "you can't sleep here." He opened his eyes. They were dark and very calm and slightly dangerous in the way that beautiful things sometimes are when you don't know what they're capable of. "I'm not sleeping," he said. "You had your eyes closed." "I was thinking, on the floor. I find it helps." Tyla stared at him for a moment. She had dealt with a lot of things on the night shift. Confused patients, difficult visitors, Dr. Kim at 1 and being dramatic about a coffee machine. She had not previously had to deal with a man in a designer suit sitting on the floor of the VIP corridor claiming to be thinking. Thinking about what? She asked, because apparently her mouth had decided they were having this conversation. He looked at the closed door beside him, room 412. My father, he said, just that. Something in the way he said it made Tyla not push further. She had a father too. She understood that some sentences were complete on their own. Okay, she said, but you still can't sit here. It's a fire hazard. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. There's a chair in the family lounge, she said, nodding down the corridor. Same floor, you can see the room from there. He looked at her for a moment like she was something he hadn't expected. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and said, Tyla. She blinked. How do you know my name? He glanced at her uniform, her name tag right there. Oh, she said. I'm Jae-won, he said. Okay, Jae-won, she said. Family lounge, left side. There's also terrible vending machine coffee if you're interested. I'm not. Smart man. She went back to her mopping. He went to the family lounge. She didn't think about it again, except she did, a little bit. On the bus home, which she would not be admitting to anyone. He came back the next night, and the night after that. His father, she eventually pieced together, had been admitted for a cardiac procedure. He was recovering. Jae-won came every evening after business hours and stayed until the early morning. He always sat in the family lounge. He always had his phone out, and his face closed off, and his shoulders carrying something heavy that he didn't talk about. Tyla did her rounds. She mopped the corridor. She refilled the tissue boxes. She did not make it a habit to stop and talk to the man in the family lounge, except sometimes she did, just for a minute. Because he was always there, and she was always passing, and it would have been rude not to at least acknowledge another human being. He's stable, Jae-won told her on the 4th night, without her asking. The doctor says another 2 weeks. That's good, she said. Stable is good. He'll hate every minute of it. He doesn't like being still. Most men don't, Tyla said. He looked at her. That's very wise. That's very obvious, she said. Have you eaten? A pause. I had something earlier. She gave him the look, the one her mother used, the one that meant she did not believe a single word coming out of his mouth. He shifted. I had coffee. That's not food. It had milk. Jae-won. Something happened when she said his name, not dramatically, just a small thing. He looked at her in a way that nobody on a VIP hospital corridor at 1 a.m. had any business looking at a hospital cleaner, and something in the air shifted just slightly. I'll eat, he said. There's a 24-hour kimbap place 2 streets left when you exit, she said, going back to her mop. Tell them Tyla sent you. They won't know who you are, but it'll make the transaction more interesting. He laughed. Not loudly, but it was a real one. She could tell. She kept mopping. She was absolutely not smiling. She was definitely smiling. By the end of the 2nd week, they had a routine that neither of them had agreed to out loud. He would arrive around 11. She would pass the lounge on her round at midnight. She would stop for 10 minutes, sometimes 15, and they would talk about nothing important, about everything. She told him about Lagos, about her mother's cooking, about the way her neighborhood smelled after rain, about studying biochemistry in a city that had no patience for softness, and how that had actually, in hindsight, prepared her very well for Seoul. He told her about his father, about growing up in a house where affection was a foreign concept and expectations were written in stone, about learning to read rooms before he could read books, about how he had not wanted to be in this city or this business or this life, but had also, somewhere along the way, stopped knowing how to want anything else. He didn't tell her what the business was. Not yet. She didn't ask. She wasn't naive. She had eyes. She had noticed the way people moved around him when he occasionally passed through the main corridor. The way the hospital director had suddenly appeared on the VIP floor and become extremely polite and extremely available. The way Jae-won's phone calls were always low and clipped and final in the way that certain kinds of authority always sounds. She noticed. She stored it. She kept talking to him anyway. Because here was the thing about Shin Jae-won that nobody who only knew him by his name or his reputation or his tax bracket would understand. He listened. Fully. Completely. In a world full of people who were always preparing their next sentence, he actually listened. And when she spoke, she felt heard in a way that was becoming increasingly inconvenient for her peace of mind. On the last night before his father was discharged, they sat in the lounge past 2 a.m. She had finished her shift but hadn't left yet. She kept telling herself she was just finishing her tea. The tea had been finished for 45 minutes. You're still here, he said. I'm finishing my tea, she said, looking at her empty cup. He looked at the cup. He didn't say anything. He was gracious like that. What happens now? She asked. When he goes home. Business continues, Jae-won said. It always does. And you? She asked. What do you want? He turned to look at her, full face. She had learned by now to hold his gaze because looking away felt like losing something. I want to see you again, he said, no preamble, no decoration, just that. Tyla's heartbeat did something it had no business doing in a hospital corridor. I work here, she said. I know. I'm not, she started. I know what you are, he said, quietly, seriously. I also know what I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment. Kimbap Place, she said finally. Saturday, noon, and you're paying because you're the one with the helicopter, he smiled. A real one this time, wide and sudden and completely at odds with everything else about him, and absolutely categorically devastating. I don't have a helicopter, he said. Yet, she said, standing up. Good night, Jae-won. Good night, Tyla. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. She could feel him watching her, and she did not turn around because she was a dignified woman and she had self-control. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. She turned around. He was still watching, still smiling, just slightly. The doors closed. She pressed her back against the elevator wall and looked at the ceiling and said quietly in Yoruba several things about herself and her own judgment that are not appropriate to repeat in a public story. Saturday happened. Then Sunday. Then the next Saturday. Then it became a thing that had a name even if they hadn't named it out loud. He would text her in the mornings, not long messages. Jae-won was not a long message person. She had gathered just small things. A place he thought she'd like. A question about something she'd said the week before. A voice note occasionally, which she refused to tell him was her favorite thing because she didn't want him to know he had leverage. He took her to places in Seoul she hadn't found yet. Not the obvious tourist places. The specific, tucked-away, you-have-to-know-someone places. A roof garden in Mapo. A bookshop in Insadong that only sold books about weather. A pajangmatcha, a street tent restaurant. In a lane so narrow it barely counted as a lane, where the owner called Jae-won by his first name and looked at Tyla like she had just solved a very long equation. He's never brought anyone here before, Bomi told Tyla the following Monday at the hospital, because of course Bomi had somehow found out because Bomi found out everything. We're just friends, Tyla said. Bomi looked at her the way a person looks at someone who has just said something so incorrect it almost loops back around to creative. Sure, Bomi said, we are. He sent you a voice note at 7 a.m. about the etymology of your name. He's curious. Tyla, Bomi. He looked up Yoruba. Tyla stared at her. He asked me, Bomi said, with the tone of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Last week, he came by the nurse's station and asked me if I knew any Yoruba because he wanted to understand what Omo meant in context. Tyla put her face in her hands. He looked it up, she said, muffled. He looked it up, Bomi confirmed. Tyla, this man who makes politicians cry, looked up Yoruba terms of endearment. He doesn't make politicians cry. My cousin's husband works in local government. He cried. That could have been about anything. It was about Shin Jae-won. Tyla straightened up, picked up her mop, and walked away with the energy of someone who was absolutely fine and had everything under control. She had nothing under control. 3 months in, on a Sunday evening at the roof garden in Mapo, with the Han River glittering below them and Seoul sprawling outward like it had always been there just for this moment, Jae-won told her what his family did. Not in broad terms, not with disclaimers, with specificity, with the kind of honesty that people use when they need someone to know the whole truth before things go any further. She listened. The whole time, she didn't interrupt. She watched the city instead of his face for part of it, which was how she processed hard things, and he had learned that about her, so he let her. When he finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, he repeated. I heard you, she said. I'm thinking. That's fair. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, are you in danger? Manageable danger, he said. That's not reassuring. No, he agreed. Would I be in danger? He looked at her very seriously. I would never allow that. Would you have control over that? More than most people. She turned to look at him then, full face. The way she always made him hold her gaze when it mattered. I'm not afraid of complicated, Jae-won, she said. I'm from Lagos. Complicated is my first language, but I need you to never lie to me, not about anything. Whatever it is, I can take it. I cannot take being deceived. Never, he said, like a contract, like something signed. She looked at the river. Then we'll figure out the rest, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, Gamsa Hamnida Tyla, Thank you, she looked at him. For what? For not running, she shrugged. I run every morning at 6. I'm not doing it twice in one day, he laughed. That real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and she felt it land somewhere in the center of her chest and settle there like it had always belonged. 6 months after that night on the roof, Shin Yi-won proposed to Tyla and Jae-won in the most aggressively anticlimactic way possible, which was on a Tuesday morning in her kitchen while she was making egusi soup, and he was sitting on her counter eating her chin-chin like he lived there. She had been complaining about Professor Choi moving her deadline again. You should just finish your degree and come work with me, he said, like this was a normal sentence. I'm not interested in the family business, she said, stirring. I have legitimate businesses too. That's what every man in your industry says. I have a pharmaceutical research division. She stopped stirring. She turned around. You have a what? I told you I was diversifying. I thought that meant restaurants. I also have restaurants. She stared at him. Yi-won, and a research division that is currently underfunded and needs a qualified biochemist who has opinions about everything and will absolutely keep everyone honest. There was a pause. Are you offering me a job? She said slowly. I'm offering you several things, he said, and held up something small between his fingers, something that caught the kitchen light and did not belong in a kitchen, something that was very clearly a ring. Tyla's spoon stopped mid-stir. That's, she said, yes, in my kitchen. You were here, the kitchen was available. I'm in an apron. You look good in the apron. There's egusi on my hand. Tyla. He said it the way he always said it when he needed her to focus. Low and steady and like her name was something he had been saving up. I have given exactly one speech in my life that I rehearsed. It was for a board meeting. It went terribly. I'm not going to rehearse a speech for the most important thing I've ever asked anyone. He looked at her, fully, completely. You are the only person in my life who has ever looked at all of me, the business, the family, the complications, the mess, and stayed. Not because of what I have, not because of what I can give, because of who I am when I'm in this kitchen eating your chin-chin at 8 in the morning pretending I'm not nervous. A pause. I'm very nervous, by the way. Tyla looked at him. Her eyes were doing something they did not have her permission to do. You're nervous, she said, extremely. Shin Yi-won is nervous. Remarkably, the man who made a politician cry, he was being dramatic. Are you going to answer the question? You didn't technically ask a question. Tyla, yes, she said, silence. Yes, he repeated. Yes, Yi-won, yes. Put the ring on my hand before I start crying into the egusi and I have to explain to my mother why her soup tasted like tears. He slid off the counter. He crossed the kitchen. He took her egusi hand very carefully and slid the ring on her finger and looked at her like she had just given him something no amount of money could have bought. Also, she said, voice only slightly unsteady, about this research division. He laughed. He pulled her in. She laughed too, with her face against his chest, egusi spoon still in her hand, absolutely not crying. She was definitely crying. A little. It was fine. Nobody could prove anything. The engagement was not announced. That was a mutual decision. Tyla wanted to finish her thesis first. Yi-won wanted to handle some internal business matters that he described as requiring resolution before my private life becomes anyone else's business. Tyla had learned to accept this kind of language without demanding specifics she didn't need. So she kept going to work. She kept mopping floors. She kept being invisible in her green uniform, Tyla and Jae-won, the quiet Nigerian cleaner who never caused trouble and was very thorough with her mop. Nobody at Seoul Grace Medical Center knew. Her ring was at home. Her name tag was on. Her mop bucket was full. Life was exactly the same as it had always been, right up until the Tuesday in March when a black helicopter with no markings landed on the hospital roof. It had started, as most disasters do, with a misunderstanding. The hospital had a new director. Director Han, who had been in the position for 3 weeks and had decided that the fastest way to establish authority was to be aggressively unpleasant to people below him on the staff hierarchy. He had made Bomi redo an entire ward inventory report over a minor formatting issue. He had told Kweku that the pharmacy felt cluttered with too many people. He had, on the previous Friday, told Tyla in front of 4 members of staff that her work was substandard, and that if she couldn't perform basic cleaning duties to hospital standards, he would find someone who could. Her work was not substandard. Her work was immaculate. She had been in that building for 8 months, and not once had anything on her shift been less than perfect. She had said nothing. She had nodded. She had gone back to work. She had also, that evening, told Yi-won none of it, because she handled her own problems, because she didn't need to be rescued. because she was Tyla and she had survived worse than a man with a new title and an old complex. What she had not accounted for was Bomi. Bomi who had been there. Bomi who had watched the whole thing. Bomi who had Yi-won's number in her phone because he had given it to her 6 months ago and said, "If anything happens to her at work, call me." To which Bomi had said, "She'll be annoyed." And Yi-won had said, "Yes," and Bomi had saved the number anyway. Bomi, who on Monday morning, after watching Director Han speak to Tyla the same way for the 4th time, found the number and typed the briefest, most devastating text message in the history of Korean cellular communication. "Your woman's boss has been disrespecting her for a week. Room 412 corridor. Thought you should know, she sent it." She put her phone down. She went back to her charts. She did not tell Tyla. Tyla was on the ground floor at 2:47 p.m. when she heard it. Everyone heard it. The sound of a helicopter landing on a hospital roof is not a subtle thing. It vibrated through the building. It brought people to windows. It caused 3 interns to abandon their lunch entirely. Tyla looked up at the ceiling. She had a feeling. The kind of feeling that lives in the stomach and has no language but is never wrong. "Oh no," she said very quietly to no one in particular. She was still holding her mop when the elevator opened on the ground floor and Shin Yi-won walked out. He was wearing a black suit. He was flanked by 2 men she recognized as his personal security, who were trying very hard to look like they were not flanking anyone. His face was composed and calm and entirely unreadable to everyone in that corridor except Tyla, who had learned to read him, and who could see very clearly that he was annoyed in the specific, controlled, dangerous way that he got when something had happened to something that was his. The corridor went very quiet. He walked straight to her. She looked at him. "Yobo," he said, "you didn't answer my calls." "I was working, Yi. I sent a helicopter. I can see that. You still didn't answer." She looked at the mop in her hand, then back at him, then at the audience. Nurse Park was gripping her clipboard with both hands. The 2 interns who had followed the sound of the helicopter were in a state that medical textbooks do not yet have a name for. Director Han had appeared at the far end of the corridor and was experiencing what appeared to be a rapid and significant recalibration of reality. Tyla looked back at Yi-won. "I just mopped this floor," she said. "I'll have it remopped." "You can't just remop." She stopped. She closed her eyes for 1 second. She opened them. "Yi-won, why are you here?" It wasn't a question. It was a sentence that meant something more specific. He looked at her for a moment. Then, because he had promised her honesty always, he said, "I heard something about your working conditions." Tyla's jaw shifted. "I was going to handle it." "I know. I don't need you to. I know that too." "Then why?" "Because," he said, and his voice dropped just slightly for her, even though the whole corridor was listening, "you handle everything alone because you're capable of it. That doesn't mean you have to, and it doesn't mean I'm going to stand somewhere comfortable while someone disrespects you." The corridor was absolutely silent. Bomi, on the 2nd floor, who had come to the railing to watch, pressed her hand over her mouth. Kweku, who had emerged from the pharmacy and was now in the lobby doorway, said nothing, but looked the way a person looks when they are witnessing the confirmation of everything they suspected. Director Han had not moved. He was the color of a man who had recently received information that had restructured his understanding of the universe. Tyla looked at Yi-won for a long moment. Her expression was complicated. It was annoyed and touched and exasperated and something warm underneath all of it. "You," she said, "are so dramatic. I prefer decisive. You landed a helicopter on the roof of a hospital. There was a helipad. That's not the point. What is the point?" "The point is," she stopped. She looked at him. She exhaled. "The point is I love you and you are going to give me a headache and you need to take your helicopter and go back to work before Dr. Kim faints." Behind her, there was a sound consistent with Dr. Kim sitting down heavily in a chair. Yi-won almost smiled. "Have dinner with me," he said. "I finish at 6. I'll send a car. A normal one. Relatively. Yi-won, no helicopter, I promise." He reached out and adjusted her cap, which had shifted. A small gesture. The kind that comes naturally when you have been with someone through kitchen mornings and hospital nights, and all the ordinary, unglamorous moments that build a real life. "I'll see you at 6. He looked at her for one more moment, like she was something he never wanted to look away from. Then he straightened his jacket and turned to address the corridor with the particular energy of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room since he was 17. "Good afternoon," he said pleasantly to the room. Nobody spoke. His eyes moved to Director Han at the end of the corridor. "Congratulations on your recent appointment," Yi-won said. The pleasantness in his tone had not changed. That was somehow the most terrifying part. I'll have my office schedule a meeting with the hospital board this week. There are some operational matters I'd like to discuss. Director Han opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Jae-won nodded, turned back to Tyla, and said quietly, 6 o'clock. Then he walked back to the elevator. His security fell into step behind him. The doors opened. He stepped in. He turned around just briefly and looked at her one more time with that expression, the one that was only ever for her before the doors closed. The lobby remained completely, spectacularly silent. Then Nurse Park said in a voice barely above a whisper, Has she always? Did everyone else know? No, said the two interns simultaneously. No, confirmed Dr. Kim from his chair. Absolutely not, said the receptionist. Tyla picked up her mop. She straightened her cap. She turned around to face the corridor. Every single person in it was staring at her. The floor, she said, is not going to mop itself. She turned and walked down the corridor. She was the picture of professionalism. She was completely composed. She rounded the corner. She was out of sight. She leaned against the wall. She smiled. Wide and private and absolutely devastating, the way she only smiled when nobody was watching. Then she picked her mop back up and got back to work, because she was Tyla Adami. And helicopter or no helicopter, she had a shift to finish. The aftermath, as these things go, was significant. By the following morning, everyone in Seoul Grace Medical Center knew. By the afternoon, everyone in the building's extended network knew. By the weekend, it had reached the kind of quiet, fast-moving social circulation that happens in closed professional communities when something extraordinary occurs. Director Han's meeting with the hospital board was scheduled for Thursday. Tyla did not know what was said. She did not ask. What she did know was that by Wednesday, Director Han had become remarkably polite, not just to her, to everyone. In the sudden, chastened way of a man who has been given a very specific piece of information about consequences. Bomi, for her role in events, received from Tyla a 2-hour silent treatment, followed by a very long stare, followed by Tyla saying, I'm not even angry, I'm just going to remember this forever. Followed by both of them eating chin-chin in the break room, and saying nothing and somehow being completely fine. You could have told me, Tyla said. You would have told me not to call him. Yes, so, a pause. He came in a helicopter, Bomi. I know, for me. I know. I was holding a mop. I know, Bomi looked at her. And he walked past the director, the board, 3 security guards, and an entire corridor of people to get to you. The woman with the mop. And then he looked at you like there was nothing else in the room. She paused. I'm not sorry. Tyla looked at her for a moment. I know, she said. She ate her chin-chin. Kweku, for his part, required a full explanation over a shared plate of jollof rice Nigerian, which Tyla had made, because the ongoing competition was still unresolved and she intended to win. And his response, after everything was told, was to sit back and look at the ceiling for approximately 15 seconds. So the man I saw on the 3rd floor 6 months ago who asked me where to find the night shift cleaner, he said slowly. Yes, said Tyla, that was Shin Jae-won. Yes, and he asked where to find you. Apparently. And I told him you were probably on the VIP floor. Tyla stared at him. You told him where I was. He said he was a family visitor. He was also the heir to a criminal empire. He was wearing a very nice suit and seemed genuinely concerned. Kweku, I thought he was worried about a patient. He had the face. What face? The worried face? He doesn't have a worried face, he has a neutral face that looks intense. Well, I didn't know that, did I? They looked at each other. Then they both started laughing, properly. The kind that comes from the stomach and takes over the whole body and makes a small kitchen feel like it's full of more people than are actually in it. Korean billionaire Mafia boss, Kweku said, wiping his eyes. Don't, Tyla said. And he landed a helicopter, Kweku, I swear, for the hospital cleaner. I will finish the rest of this jollof alone. This is the greatest thing that has ever happened in Seoul Grace Medical Center. It is not. It is, Tyla. You know it is. She tried to hold her face. She failed. She laughed again. Fine, she said. It might be a little. A little, he repeated, grinning. Don't push it. He pushed it exactly the right amount for the rest of the evening. She finished her thesis in April. Professor Choi, upon receiving it, described it as competent. This was, Bomi had explained, the academic equivalent of Professor Choi kneeling down and weeping with joy. Tyla chose to receive it as the compliment it almost was. The defense was in May. She passed. She went home and called her mother. Her mother cried, which was expected. Her mother then asked about Jae-won, which was also expected. Her mother had met him at Christmas. A meeting that had gone better than Tyla had dared hope. partly because Jae-won had learned 3 phrases in Yoruba before the visit, which had made her mother laugh so hard she'd had to sit down, and partly because he had sat with her mother in the kitchen for 2 hours talking about food and family and things that mattered, while Tyla's cousins did what cousins always do, which was interrogate him in the other room and report back inconsistently. "He is a serious man," her mother had said. "Yes," Tyla had agreed. "He looks at you like you're something precious." Tyla hadn't said anything to that. "That's good," her mother had said simply. "That's the most important thing." After the phone call, Tyla sat in the kitchen for a moment. The ring was on her finger now full time. The thesis was done. The next chapter was beginning. There was a research division to join and a life to build and a man who looked at her like she was something precious waiting for her to call and tell him how it went. She called. He picked up on the first ring. He always did. "Passed," she said. A pause, then Molly? Really? In that way he sometimes slipped into Korean when he was feeling something he didn't have a prepared sentence for. "Molly," she confirmed. "Tyla," her name again, in that way. "Don't make it weird," she said. "I'm not making it weird. You're making the face. You can't see my face." "I can hear your face," he laughed. "Dinner tonight, anywhere you want." "Kimbap place," she said. "The original one." A beat of recognition, the beginning of them. "Perfect," he said. She hung up. She sat in the kitchen for 1 more minute in the apartment that smelled like her jollof and had her books on the shelves and her mop uniform on the hook. The last night she would have it there because she had decided finally to let herself have the next thing. She looked at her ring. She looked at the kitchen where he had proposed badly and perfectly with chin-chin in his hand. She smiled. Then she went to get ready for dinner. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in August, Tyla and Jae-won walked into Seoul Grace Medical Center for the last time as an employee. She had given proper notice. She had trained her replacement. She had left her section cleaner than she found it, because that was who she was, and no ring or research division or helicopter was going to change her standards. She stopped at the nurse's station to say goodbye to Bomi, who cried and made her promise to come back every month for chin-chin in the break room. She stopped at the pharmacy to say goodbye to Kweku, who handed her a container of jollof rice and told her it was better than hers, which it was not, and they both knew it, and that was fine. She stopped at the end of the VIP floor corridor, room 412, where it had started. A man on the floor in a suit with his eyes closed, and a cleaner with a mop, and 10 minutes of the most unexpected conversation. She looked at it for a moment. Then she nodded, the way you nod at a place that changed your life, and took the elevator down. Jae-won was outside in the car. He was on his phone because he was always on his phone, but he looked up when she came through the doors and got out and took her bag from her before she could protest, and opened the door, and she got in, and he got in, and the car pulled away from Seoul Grace Medical Center and out into the city. She looked out the window at Seoul going past. Her city now fully, not temporary anymore. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it. "Like something is starting," she said. He reached across and took her hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She leaned her head back. She watched the city. She felt the ring on her finger and the beginning of everything after. Outside, Seoul moved and breathed and lived around them. And Tyla and Jae-won, who had arrived with 2 suitcases and an optimistic attitude and not quite enough money, and who had mopped floors and called home and eaten jollof and found, in the most unexpected corner of her life, something real. Tyla and Jae-won was exactly where she was supposed to be. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know you need to subscribe. Hit that button, drop me a comment, tell me your favorite moment, tell me if you cried, tell me if you're Team Bomi because honestly, same, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. New stories drop every week and the next one. Let's just say somebody's about to find out their quiet new neighbor has a very interesting past. Don't miss it. I'll see you there.